Today, we have our latest COVID-19 and State of the World update with Daniel Wagner, up next on the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. I'm Ben Catania, your host. This is my show all about risk and uncertainty across all domains and walks of life. And for the past few months, we have been checking in on the state of the world since the start of the coronavirus global pandemic with Daniel Wagner, who's our resident guest on geopolitics and current affairs. He's the CEO of Country Risk Solutions and a very distinguished author and speaker. And today I bring you our latest installment of this check-in, and we recorded this on June the 9th, 2020, which means we certainly covered the latest on COVID-19, but a lot of our emphasis was on the United States and the protests and riots in the US following the murder of George Floyd. We also talked about geopolitics and lots more. So without any further delay, let's just get right into it. Here is Daniel Wagner. Enjoy. Daniel, welcome back. This is now a 4 to 6 weekly ritual that we seem to have talking about COVID and the state of the world. It's going to be fun, and this is always very insightful, so welcome.
Always great to be back, Ben. And seems to me that it might as well be a conversation starting from scratch, because in the space of 4 to 6 weeks, there's just too much to talk about, and the landscape has again changed completely.
Well, let's get into it. We were talking about COVID and herd immunity and all of that good stuff about 6 weeks ago. And since then, in your part of the world, race riots and some interesting developments and interesting statements from your president has kicked off a whole range of things. So let's maybe talk about that, and then we can talk about what it all means. But what is your take on the last few weeks with what's happened in Minneapolis and then the riots that have occurred and the government's response and all of that good stuff right in the middle of a pandemic?
Yeah, couldn't it be more perfect, right? Well, it seems to me this might as well be the 1960s, because in some respects, America has made very little progress in race relations and civil rights. In other respects, of course, it is light years worth of difference. I think if you're on the receiving end of police brutality and you're a person of color, it doesn't really feel too much different than it did 2 generations ago. And I think the big issue for me is just how much tolerance there appears to be for this sort of thing. The officer in Minneapolis who killed Mr. Floyd, he had been reprimanded numerous times, and they kept him on the force, and he didn't receive any serious reprimand, which is part of the reason, I suppose, why he kept doing it. There are 18,000 police forces in the United States, both on local and state level, and many of them are just fine. And the vast majority of people in the police force here, as in almost everywhere else, are great people. They do their job very well. People have confidence in them, etc. I'm troubled, however, by this culture of silence that pervades many things in this country and in life in general. And this whole see something, say something, which has become very popular since 9/11 when you're riding in public transportation, etc., it really needs to apply to this. Those 3 officers who were aiding and abetting this guy in killing Mr. Floyd, they didn't say anything. I mean, what on earth is wrong with these people? I don't understand.
I don't know what it's like to be a person of color, but when I see something like this, it makes me quite angry. But I also try to put myself in the shoes of someone who may be worried about getting stopped by the police in the United States because of the color of their skin. And then it becomes, a life-threatening engagement potentially. And what does that do for the state of law enforcement? Because I imagine what it means is it lowers trust between a section of the populace and law enforcement authorities, and therefore crimes don't go reported, and a whole range of things happen that really the rot kind of spreads into the rest of the society.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It pervades and impacts so many other things. In listening to various news programs and podcasts over the last 2 weeks here, I've heard countless stories of people who were saying, people our age who are saying that they grew up, if they were in the South or they were in a place where the Klan was very active, they had to plan which roads they went on, which they did not, whether they bothered or were brave enough to go out at night, etc. I mean, these are the sorts of things that you would have imagined would have occurred during slavery in this country, 150 years ago. Why is it that the South in general in the U.S. still has the reputation for having some degree of acceptability for institutionalized racism? How is it that America could have had an African-American president for 2 terms and this kind of stuff could still be going on? I think what needs to happen is that culture of silence needs to change, and it needs to become everybody's business when they see something to say something, and they should not have to worry about being reprimanded for doing so. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that combined with the general tension and malaise that people in America have related to COVID and whether they're going to be able to pay their rent or mortgage, whether they're going to have a job tomorrow, just to add this is intolerable, absolutely intolerable. Mm-hmm. It's like almost as if you were going to plan something. The next thing we need now, and of course, since it is hurricane season, we'll probably have a terrible hurricane that's going to hit at the same time. I mean, when it rains, it really does pour. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, at the helm, we have someone who's uniquely unqualified to deal with all that stuff, and of course is making it 10 times worse than it needs to be. Clearly, American historians are not going to be very kind to Mr. Trump.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've been following some of this stuff as well, and I'm not an American, but I was surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been, but surprised to learn how deep and pervasive the kind of systemic racism is in law enforcement in the United States, and how far back it goes. And there's a podcast by NPR that talked about this that I was quite taken aback, because it seems like, as someone who is as a Canadian and living in the UK, as much as I'm appalled by the actions of your president, there's always, and I hope I speak for a lot of people in the Western world, there are people, many of us, who look up to the United States and look to the United States for leadership. And when you see these kinds of things going on domestically in the year 2020, it does undermine a lot of confidence, I would have thought, not just on the part of an ordinary citizen like me, but perhaps outside of that and into geopolitics. But perhaps you're saying, does it really matter with regard to the U.S. and its relations with its allies in the rest of the world? What is this effect of?
Absolutely, because we've lost our moral authority. Many European countries, as you will be aware, are no longer even paying attention to what our president says or does. They're just sort of ignoring him and disregarding it outright. It's hard to imagine that, 4 years, almost 4 years since he was elected, there's been this radical transformation of bilateral relationships among our closest allies. Our relationship with the UK certainly has been impacted, obviously with Germany and France and many other European nations. Clearly, I'm one of those people who really, really hopes that there's a change in leadership in January. But in saying that, I'm also mindful that 5 months till the election is a very long time. And I wrote a piece recently where I was saying Biden's election is certainly not a foregone conclusion, even with all of the outrages Mr. Trump continues to pile on the American people and the world. Part of the problem there, of course, is that Biden is a weak candidate on so many levels. Nobody really understands what he stands for. He has been ineffective in rallying the base. And I think what's probably going to happen in the election is it's really going to boil down to who can rally more people on their side of the ledger to the polls. It's not really going probably to boil down to much other than that.
Well, it's very difficult to predict, obviously. I mean, 5 months is an eternity. I think this time 4 years ago, Trump wasn't even certain to get the Republican nomination. And there were many doubts over that.
Well, that's right. Almost nobody believed he would, except him, of course.
And 4 years ago, we were entering a referendum over here on Brexit that most people didn't think would go the way it did. So you are right. 5 months is an eternity. And I've been reading that some of the polls have Biden in front by 12 percentage points or something, something like that. But that can disappear in a heartbeat.
That's right. Most of the polls say between 8 and 10%, which is enormous if it were to happen. I think part of the problem here, even with his lead, is that he's staying at home, like so many other people, and is simply being perceived as an old guy in his rocking chair. And he stumbles over his words, and he doesn't look particularly healthy, and he looks weak. And he could solve that very easily by taking his dogs out for a walk on Main Street. That would do wonders. You can wear a mask while you do that. I think there's a bigger problem here, though, and that is that the party elders, the Democratic Party elders, they have such a stranglehold on the leadership of the party, whether it's Pelosi or Schumer or Biden. I mean, if you want to have a clear difference, if you want people to see that you are something other than the other person on the other side of the aisle, you got to stand for something. You need a new platform. You need younger people representing you. And both parties in this country are guilty of not doing that. They've just got their heels dug in. And of course, the partisanship is intolerable. It's almost miraculous that they had enough bipartisan juice between them to come up with this multi-trillion-dollar package that they both, of course, took credit for. But one of the interesting things about that, I think, is it used to always be that it was the Democrats who were for big platforms that protected the common man and woman. And now, with this rescue package having been delivered to every adult in America in one fashion or another, the Democrats no longer have a monopoly on that. It's ironic that here the Republicans are presiding over and pushing what is essentially a form of socialism by giving all this money to all the people and all these benefits. I'm pretty sure they're going to be playing that card come November if they're not going to play it sooner. The other thing is that Biden has a 40-plus year record in Congress, which the Republicans can have a field day with in terms of picking at any single vote that he did or didn't take, and why did he take it, and who paid him, and who was supporting him, et cetera. So I see this getting pretty messy.
It seems eerily like 4 years ago. It really does. A weak candidate and an establishment candidate against the Donald. Okay, well, let's see how that plays out. So in the midst of this, of course, we've got the COVID-19 pandemic. And it seems to me that the U.S. is particularly not well equipped to deal with the pandemic, as we, at least certainly this is what I think has been revealed of the last few weeks. What do you think this means for the election and for the United States, the prospect of, for example, a second wave coming and the way in which the pandemic's been handled?
Well, it has been atrocious. from the start. It continues to be. If you want to test in this country, you still have to get a doctor's note. Very few places have drive-by capacity where you simply line up, drive by, get a test, and however many minutes later you've got your result. I think it's pretty clear we're setting ourselves up for a minimum of a second wave. And it's entirely possible that'll come this summer, not even in the fall. I mean, it's mandated that people are supposed to be wearing masks in most of the states. It's certainly mandated here in Connecticut. But I can tell you from my own experience, having gone to any number of grocery stores, most people are wearing them. But I confronted somebody the other day who wasn't, and she told me to mind my own business, of course, as she's breathing on the produce section. And, I sort of reminded her that actually it is my business and it is the law. But nobody else said anything. Here again, that culture of silence, right? Everybody's swarming around her. They see she doesn't have a mask. Nobody says anything. We also went the other night for the first time in months to go out for an evening. And we went on patios. The patios are the only places where restaurants can actually serve people these days, outdoor patios. And nobody on this patio was wearing a mask, of course, except me. And the waitress who was wearing a mask had it covering only her mouth, not her nose. And then she came out of the kitchen on one of her runs in and out of the kitchen, and it was under her chin when she came out. And in the meantime, she's fist pumping with the kids and touching all the plates. And it's like, I decided I don't think I'm going to be going out again for a while.
Yeah.
It's just asking for trouble.
It's interesting how behavior is going to be changed and modified, and how some people will probably a minority are going to be like you and I, but there's a range of people that feel like they've been cooped up for several weeks now, and they want to let go a little bit, and let's see what that leads to.
I think the problem is that not all these people recognize that it's not just whether I'm going to give it to you, it's whether you're going to give it to me. And we all have a common duty, apart from it being the law, it's just common sense as well as some aspect of morality, that we should be protecting our fellow man and woman as well by wearing a mask. It doesn't seem like that much to do. But the fact that so many people don't, and you've probably seen the news reports of these bars in Michigan and these parties and house parties in various places where, dozens or hundreds of people are gathering. Nobody's wearing a mask. It's just asking for trouble. I think must be an element of invincibility about this, right? Well, it's been 3 months and I haven't gotten it. And where has this gotten us? And I don't even know anybody who's got it, et cetera. I think we're just asking for a heap of trouble, and it's probably going to get ugly.
Well, on top of that, I think perhaps one of these unintended consequences of all these riots and protests. We talk about riots, but let's not forget there have been peaceful protests with lots of people who have not rioted, damaged property, these kinds of things. But I imagine people see those news reports, and then there's there's potentially a backlash that says, well, why is it that all these people get to protest and I can't get a haircut?
Sure, exactly. That's exactly how most people undoubtedly think. And we all know people who've gone for months without a haircut, and they all certainly want a haircut. They want their hair colored. They want their nails done. I get it. Yeah, it's important to people. So that all said, I'm not optimistic. Certainly in America, we have 2 million cases here. We have over 110,000 dead. The latest projection is that we'll have something like 165,000 dead by the end of the summer, and certainly it could be more than that. But in so many places, the infection rate continues to increase. So we were supposed to only be flinging the doors open for people to get out and about if we could have sustainable rates on the decline for something like 2 weeks. There's very few places in America where that's happened. And even if it did, now that the doors have been flung open, those rates are increasing again, and many hospitals are filling up again. And that's even before we've got a formal spike. So do the math on that.
This is really troubling, worrying, but also really frustrating to me. Because not just in the United States, but here as well, when you compare it to New Zealand, who's just declared themselves COVID-19 free and what they have done. And we're just not good at projecting a bit forward and thinking about uncertainty, not just ourselves as individuals, but policymakers in particular. We're not very good at this. I mean, if we had, say, in the middle of December, said, all right, this thing is happening, we're going to shut down the global economy for, say, a month, we would have killed it, right? There would have been a way to destroy coronavirus. And, we've been through this in previous podcasts, but it looks like that would have been a great thing to do now. And here we are now opening up when in many places the testing regime isn't in place, the tracing regime isn't in place. We're just kind of asking for it.
Yeah, we certainly are. And we're not even talking per se about places like Latin America where, they're fast becoming the global epicenter. The odd thing here, the really amazing, surprising thing, is that the Trump White House doesn't even really want to talk about this stuff anymore. They've gotten rid of their COVID czar without replacing him. They don't have daily briefings anymore. Even Dr. Fauci hasn't been seen in weeks. So it's almost like they're thinking, well, if we don't talk about it, people won't think about it and everything will be fine. In our case, it doesn't help, Ben, that we've got a person like Trump in the White House who's totally preoccupied with his reelection and with the economic performance of the economy. He's not the only person who has that preoccupation, of course, but the level of irresponsibility is shocking. And when I think about how history is going to judge him, I think they're basically going to say one of the things he is a killer, because his policies are literally killing Americans by the thousands. If we had an approach like a Singapore or a South Korea, and we locked down and we just hunkered down and we did what we need to do and we had the testing regime and we had planned properly and we recognized that people need to wear masks sooner than 2 months into this thing, things might well be very different. But there's also the problem that we have, which is that you might as well be dealing with 50 different countries here, because they all have their own rules and they all have their own preferences, and whether they're rural or urban helps define how they see the world and whether they feel they're at risk, et cetera, et cetera. It's just messy.
Also, in contrast to many other developed economies, the U.S. does not have the same social safety nets that we can afford even here in the U.K., in which the government has helped businesses pay their workers 80% of their wages so that companies don't go bankrupt and people still have an income. And it does make it more of a shock absorber that it seemingly does not exist in the U.S. And therefore you've got all this pressure to open up the economy once again.
That's exactly right. See whether this orientation toward having a bigger social safety net and having bigger government is going to last beyond this year. Certainly, as long as the outbreak is going on, that's going to be an underlying theme. I do wonder if Mr. Trump were reelected, whether that would stay that way. Much of it will depend, of course, on the composition of the Congress. And it's anybody's guess whether this is a clean sweep either way, as I've said. So all I can say is stay tuned. And, if we talk about this in another month or so, I have a feeling we'll be having partly the same conversation, but some differences as well. Maybe something will become a little bit clearer now. That's part of the problem, is that we've got the WHO saying that asymptomatic people can't really pass this to somebody. And then they come out the next day and they make a correction and they say, well, there's still plenty we don't know and we can't say anything in absolute terms. And you just don't know what to believe. And in fairness, I think there's a lot of people who presume something is the case without being able to prove it. I did read something interesting the other day, though, and that was about a Norwegian scientist who claims that he has proof that the COVID-19 virus was actually produced in a laboratory, and that would mean in China, because it was genetically modified. He said one of the reasons he felt that was that it did not morph, it did not modify itself to be able to better invade its human hosts after it was unleashed into the environment, i.e. that it already had that capability. And here again, who knows what's fact and what's fiction, but I always was leery about the idea that the scientific community could say with such certainty that this was not modified or produced in a laboratory. I just don't know how they can say that. I guess if I was a virologist, I might have an easier answer with that, but to be able to say anything with clarity about this at this point just seems to me to be a big question mark.
Well, I think this has been an interesting case study in risk communication and in uncertainty management, and how institutions need to grapple with a very fast-moving situation, and they don't have all of the information, and they need to respond, but also quite possibly a lack of, I don't know if it's a lack of communication, but certainly a lack of understanding on the part of the general population about how much uncertainty is in the system, and that institutions are trying to cope with it as best they can, but that it's these things are going to happen inevitably in a situation like this, where guidance will be provided, it'll be retracted, and it certainly undermines credibility, but which has already been pretty low of public institutions. I don't know what the answer is, but it clearly hasn't worked very well in terms of communication to the public of what's required and what's not required, and dispelling myths. I mean, there's a pandemic of misinformation as well in terms of all of this.
That's a good point. Yeah, I would agree with that. Although 3 months into it, I think most people understand in general what this thing is and does not understand why they're not going to work, why mommy's at home instead of doing something else during the day, et cetera. I think that part they've got. I think there's just a willingness on the part of so many people to be willfully ignorant about what kind of information they need to have about things like this. They're just tuned out. They're focused on YouTube videos and instant gratification and whatever it might be, and that's why, in part, it's as bad as it is.
Could we talk a little bit about China, a country that you've been studying and have written a couple of books around, particularly in relation to the United States, and what all of this means to the situation between the two great powers of the world currently, the United States and China?
Sure. So clearly, it hasn't been good for bilateral relations. But again, I think this is one of those things where China, the Chinese government, when I say China, I mean the government, they really did this to themselves, right? I mean, they could have handled this differently than they had handled SARS and previous instances of problems in their country where they just tried to keep it under cover. They weren't transparent. If they released information, it wasn't necessarily accurate. Why do they continue to do that? I mean, it can't improve their lot with their relationship with the rest of the world by continuing to do so, and yet they continue to do so. I think they're just deathly afraid of anything that smacks of a hint of instability, anything that might threaten their position. And if anything, as you're undoubtedly aware, they've clamped down even harder throughout this thing than they did before. It's just all about preserving the sanctity of the Chinese Communist Party. It's about making sure that nobody gets out of line, that nobody gets any ideas that in a time of crisis like this, it's maybe time to think about replacing them, etc. That's what's at the heart of their response. Also worth noting how opportunistic the government has been while this has been going on. They're continuing to ramp up their presence in the South China Sea by doing military exercises. They're continuing to have relationships with bad actors around the world and do things that are antithetical to international law. They're continuing to fan the flames in any way that they can, because, and I understand why they're doing this in part, because while the world is preoccupied, they see it as an opportunity to get some things done. Again, without other governments necessarily either noticing or saying anything about it. So it's like we're collectively sleeping, and while we're sleeping, they're roaming around doing stuff. I suppose that's human nature, and I suppose if we were them, we might well do the same thing. But it's having a cumulative impact on bilateral relationships throughout the world that they're having. For example, there were a couple of films in China called The Wolf Warrior. And The Wolf Warrior was a famous, Chinese warrior, someone who either within China or outside of China was, beating the nationalist drum and doing good and, fighting evil, etc., whoever that might be. That's not an uncommon theme for films, but what's happened is that, the Chinese people have really gravitated toward this, and this has manifested itself in terms of diplomacy. Now China has something called wolf diplomacy. And what they're doing is they may not necessarily go after the U.S. directly on a given subject, but what they're doing is they're also going after American allies. For example, when Australia had an issue with the Chinese response to COVID and called for a global inquiry, the Chinese suspended beef imports from Australia. There have been a bunch of other countries, your country, Canada, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands. There's a backlash going on now. And individually, they're saying, we don't like what it is that you're doing. If we speak out, they're going to lash out. And it's sort of this tit for tat approach to diplomacy that's going on now, which is pretty unsightly. It's not an attractive thing at all. And yet it's becoming the new normal. So it's really...
Well, this is just China using its power, and we just have to get used to it, because it's going to be like this going forward for a lot of the time, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we have to expect this going forward. They're certainly not the only ones beating the nationalist drum. Yeah. Most every country is doing that at time like this.
Yeah. How could we better hold China to account for things like this? I guess maybe is a little bit more of a positive spin on the same question, because we should expect this type of behavior, but it really isn't acceptable from the point of view of multilateralism and international cooperation and all of that kind of stuff. But it seems like China has domestically unleashed this wave of nationalism that's they've worked their public over into a frenzy, and they're manifesting that internationally as well. It's power politics. It's also, but very much soft power politics when you talk about banning beef imports from Australia and things like this, things that China can do now that they couldn't have done just a short time ago, and we should expect them to do. But how can the rest of the world hold China to account in ways that we just haven't been doing so far?
I'd say there are two things that need to be done. One is that every time something like this happens, the government in question needs to object strongly. But more importantly, I think we need to bring back into the equation the concept of collective action. And when we have, diplomatic relations frayed on so many levels, from America with its allies, it's difficult to agree on a collective course of action. And yet, if we did, if Europe and the States and Australia, et cetera, did, it would make a difference, because China doesn't want to be perceived as itself against the world. And when it's picking individualized fights like this, it's easier for it to say, No, I just have a problem with Sweden. I don't have a problem with everyone. But then if everybody comes back and says, actually, we've got a problem with you, I'd like to believe that that may make a difference. But the truth is, it may not. I think the Chinese government has sort of drunk its own Kool-Aid at this point, and having doubled down, having tightened things up, and Xi Jinping thought, and the CCP forever, and all that kind of stuff, I think they're just, going further and further down a hole. I'm not sure what the answer is or how it's all going to end, but we have a responsibility, I think, in the West to object and also to combine forces wherever we can.
Yeah, I agree. And we should be looking at history and some of even these, ancient texts like the Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War and things like this that tell us a lot about power politics and how these things evolve. We've been there before as a human race, and we have some inkling as to what may happen, and we also have some new ideas that we can deploy, perhaps that we haven't before deployed in statecraft. But that requires a level of understanding, sophistication, etc., that certainly is not in existence right now in the White House, and certainly not in existence right now here in the UK. But we have the tools. We have the tools to think about the world differently, and we've talked about this before. I like to think of the prospect of this situation with COVID-19 as being perhaps a bit of a wake-up call, but who knows?
Yeah, well, it is on so many levels. I'm inclined to think, however, that the state of affairs that is developing now bilaterally between Washington and Beijing, I think that's likely to be a semi-permanent feature to their relationship going forward. I see a sudden thaw developing here. Even if Biden were to get in, I think Washington has become so accustomed to thinking of China in these, person terms that I don't see how things get better. But in fairness, until and unless China changes its behavior, I mean, they're still hacking, they're still stealing intellectual property from America and around the world. Until and unless they stop that, there's really no reason for us to think about them differently. And perhaps that's the way we want it. Maybe they figure we're kind of weak in terms of our ability to prevent them from these hacks and to prevent our intellectual property from being stolen. So they're just going to continue as long as they possibly can, as long as they're getting a net advantage out of the process. That must be what they're thinking. I'm not sure what else it could be.
Yeah, possibly weak, and also, I don't know, hypocrites, maybe, historically, when it comes to relationships with Latin America and Africa and other parts of Asia and the world, that look at what's happening in the US, and this is the American image is actually about, colonialism and duplicity and state, intervention in other states. We've never done any of that. So,
well,
that's
exactly right, and exactly right, and it's certainly fodder for them to be able to look at the race riots going on now and say, well, you were lecturing us during Hong Kong about how we should be nice to the rioters and how we shouldn't crack down, and look at what it is that you want to do. That raises the question, which we haven't talked yet about whether the deployment of military forces would have been appropriate here. I think the average person here is a fan of law and order, and I think if the unbridled looting that was going on for days and days, nights and nights, I should say, were to continue for weeks on end, I suspect most people would say, look, the National Guard isn't cutting it. Let's bring in the troops and sort this out. We have multiple incidences in the past where American presidents have actually deployed U.S. troops to get things back in order, whether it was race riots in Watts or Kent State or whatever the case might be. Clearly, we don't want to make a habit of that, but for people to simply say, we can't do that, I think the average person, if they get their window bashed in or their business torched, they're going to say, please bring on the troops. I think that raises another issue, and that is that we're still preoccupied with political correctness and not wanting to offend people to the extent that it's actually detrimental to our own interests sometimes. This is one of the things that I actually think Trump got right when he was in the election mode in 2016, and he says we don't really have time for political correctness anymore. I generally agree with that. I think political correctness has gotten some things right, but it's gotten a lot of other things wrong. And I'm more in favor of just being honest and saying, here's what needs to be done. Maybe I'm being too simplistic here. I don't know.
I don't know either. And it raises all types of interesting questions about freedom of speech, as has the coronavirus situation around freedom of speech. But simplistically, I continue to think, well, freedom of speech is fine to the point at which it doesn't harm others, and then it becomes a bit of a problem. So I don't know. But the other thing I wanted to touch base with you on is around these riots and around any riots. And sometimes we don't really know what goes on in any movement that is protesting, and if and when those protests become violent. I spoke to a guy on my podcast called Sergej Popovic, he led this Otpor movement that overthrew Milosevic, and it was a nonviolent resistance movement. And he took a lot of principles from the study of nonviolent activism. And one of the things that struck me about that conversation is that as soon as protest movements become violent, or damage property and do these kinds of things, they lose popular support. So it's very important, if you're trying to affect change, that you don't do that, right? And I do wonder, however, if there are agitators that look to provoke. I've seen some videos of, for example, just a pile of bricks being left outside in the middle of, I can't remember which cities these were, but you just wonder, I wonder who left them there and what type of thing they wanted to have happen. And similarly with what's happened in Hong Kong, what types of forces have been involved in those protests and what those things do, because as soon as you disrupt everyday life, it becomes very difficult to maintain popular support for a movement.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think everybody's in favor of free speech and civil rights and the right to peacefully protest. The line that needs to be drawn, and I think this is what a lot of commentators aren't necessarily saying, is there is a distinction to be made between absolute support for civil rights and protests and freedom of speech, and becoming violent and damaging people and property. I think I got to say, 95% of the people in general, in every country, would probably say, no, that's just not acceptable. And yet, I think it's important to point out that if we look at American and other countries' history, it is often only when people get violent and stop being peaceful and stop saying please and thank you, that change can happen. Certainly that's been true in some aspects of America. The civil rights movement here wasn't only about peaceful protest. And I think there's just a fear on my part that we have to get to that stage again before there will be even more meaningful change. I hope we don't get there.
Well, I think sometimes memes are powerful, right? That the pictures of the American football player Colin Kaepernick taking a knee and the uproar that created, and that these things become memes where you see people protesting like this, and they say, we want you to protest, but do it peacefully. Oh, and they show a picture of Colin Kaepernick and say, no, not like that, and then other peaceful protests, not like that. So I can understand the anger as well. Peaceful protests didn't exist, therefore this is how we need to get your attention, guys.
People only listen so much if they're, if they're not forced to listen. I think that's part of the issue.
Yeah, it's complex, but it's also really worrying. And 50 years on from all these riots in the 1960s, it's similarly worrying. I don't know. I like to think there's a little bit more hope and civilization in your country and in all countries, but particularly right now in your country.
I absolutely agree. I just wish someone else was at the helm. We would have a better chance of having some sort of a meaningful outcome here.
Mm. Well, what else is on your mind globally? And we haven't talked about Russia that much. We haven't talked about other global hotspots or geopolitical topics. What are some things that perhaps in the midst of all of this we aren't really paying as much attention to as we ought to?
Well, if we look at some of the recent hotspots, they've just gone, either they've gone quiet or they've gone quiet in the news. I mean, we rarely hear anything about North Korea these days, except that it declared that it was no longer having any communication with South Korea today. One has to wonder how America got from this love-in between, or bromance, if you will, between Trump and Kim Jong-un to absolute silence. I have to wonder if anything's going on behind the scenes at all. I don't really have any way of knowing. Also, when you think about Iran, things have gotten very quiet on that front. Things have gotten quiet in Yemen. You hear nothing in the news about it. I mean, even go on a platform like Al Jazeera, you can barely find any news on it. I don't know whether the world is just completely consumed by COVID and all the other sensational headlines that are going on, that they just aren't thinking about this stuff at all, or whether some sort of behind the scenes progress is being made. I don't think that's likely to be the case. Where Russia is concerned, they were a bit late to the COVID party, but clearly they're having their issues now. So is Brazil. These countries which have these strongmen who say, not in my backyard, or it's not going to affect us, etc. Well, they're being proven wrong. I don't think that's going to mean that they're going to be overthrown anytime soon. But it's certainly got to contribute to this sense of underlying malaise and, objectiveness, lack of objectiveness, I'd say, and people opposing these leaders. Unfortunately, they're going to run their term and do their damage before anything happens. It's just amazing to me how we have these news cycles which go from one sensational story to another that have just basically gone silent. I don't know how to explain it. On these issues, they're silent. On other things, of course, they're pounding it down our throats every day.
Well, it's all about narrative, right? It's all about narrative and story. And when one story goes cold, then you've got to find the next one. So I'm sure some of that stuff will come back, but it's always interesting to look beneath the headlines as we do to things that might be bubbling underneath. Who knew? I'm
also concerned, Ben, about the impact that all of this is going to have on the progress that has been made where the climate change movement is concerned, for example. People are just focused on other stuff. Funding is being drained for other things.
Right.
And, the war on poverty globally, the impact this is having on all of that, it's very concerning. Nobody's really talking about all the children, extremely poor people who are going to be dying as a result of this thing. And their figures will be much greater than the actual people who die from the virus. I think it's important to maintain perspective in all this, and I hope we can.
I hope we can as well. I also like to think of this as, a bit of an opportunity to rethink, for example, our relationship with nature, because let's face it, there's every possibility that this was created because of that. And even if these allegations of this thing having come from a lab are true, it still underscores the fragility of our relationship with Mother Nature. and our need to do something around that. And we talked about a little bit here, the next thing we need is a big storm somewhere. These things seem to happen regularly. So I like to think of this as an opportunity to rethink how we interact with the world. I don't have a huge amount of optimism that it's going to turn into that right away. Quite the opposite, perhaps. It's been very divisive, but I do like to think that there's a little bit more scope potentially for rethinking our approach to the climate, multilateralism, all of these things that do require a bit of a change, a lot of a change of approach.
I hope we have the wherewithal to be able to do that, my friend. Seems to me that a lot of people are going to be changing their focus just to basic needs and political change at the ballot box and other things that, those types of shifts in focus happen every 2 or 4 years or whatever the cycle is in a given country. But what's going on at the same time, of course, is an assault on human rights in general. You take, for example, what's going on in the Philippines, where the president has basically said that any form of dissent can be labeled terrorism. And you wonder what might be possible in other countries. I'm hopeful that in the place where you and I live, in the UK and in the US, that we're not going down that road. But then again, if things get bad enough, people get desperate enough, there's enough despair, there's enough people saying, what have I got to lose, that law and order can slowly disappear in the process and things could spin out of control. Let's not forget, so much of the compliance that is mandated, if you will, for wearing masks and staying at home, et cetera, that stuff's all voluntary. There's no way for the authorities to enforce it. In China, there is. In some other countries, there are, but certainly not in your or my country. And if people decide that, collectively they no longer want to comply, there's very little that anybody can do.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and there have already been loads of cases, certainly in the U.S., of confrontation between those who think, you mentioned going up to a woman in a grocery store. Well, some of those interactions have gotten violent in other parts of your country.
They certainly have, yeah. And of course, here we always have to worry about somebody packing a gun in the process.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Which makes people think twice about saying anything, which contributes again to the culture of silence. So it's this circularity that goes on. I mean, God forbid we should get to the point where we can't even ask somebody if they've thought about doing something differently for fear of getting shot. I mean, what kind of a world would that be?
And we're all a bunch of spoiled 5-year-olds or with guns and, the ability to cause harm sometimes. I mean, it's not all of us, obviously, but certainly a few very prominent heads of state are. Well, we've covered a lot of territory as always. Were there other things that are worthy of mention at this point in time that you think we just haven't touched on?
I just hope we don't lose track of our common humanity and the things that are really important. And I hope that much of the progress that's been made on a whole host of issues over the last decade or two aren't somehow lost in the process. If that's the case, then, as tragic as all of the deaths are, that would be equally tragic. And I'm hopeful that we will return to a world that we recognize when this is all over. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed.
Well, I hope for that as well. That sounds like a really good place to wrap things up. But thank you very much for joining us yet again. And I think we'll continue to do this little series because it's interesting to check in and take the pulse of the state of the world. So thank you for joining us.
Anytime, Ben. Talk to you soon.
All right. All the best.
All right, that's it. I hope you found that insightful. As always, let us know what you think. Check out the show notes. And if you enjoy the show and if you enjoy this episode, give us a like and a share or a review. That helps us out a lot. We will be back very soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.